Okay, so this is the Node benchmarking meeting, January 7th, 2016. So far we have myself, Michael Dawson, Ali Sheik, Chris Bailey, Gareth Udom, and Young from Netflix, as well as, I think it was Paul you mentioned, right?
Michael Paulson.
So Michael Paulson, sorry about that.
Hi.
The agenda for today is to do a roundtable of what we've each been working on, talk about the active issues to see if there's any other progress or discussion there, and I added to the agenda item talking about the initial proposal for sort of a little bit of framework code that we can use to run and enable generating charts for benchmark data and then publish that to the Node website. So is there anything else people want to add to the agenda before we get started? If not, okay, we can start with the roundtable.
Michael?
Yeah, sorry.
This is Uttam. I just want to add one thing. I set up my Acme app and I set up JMeter to run the benchmark. And I just want to know if there is a standard JMeter configuration, and is that the only workload we are using right now to test or do any benchmarking? Or do we have any more additional workloads in addition to Acme?
Right, okay, so I'll add to the agenda an item to talk about Acme Air and those issues. Okay, so a roundtable, I'm going to go from left to right in terms of the who I see in Google, the Google Hangout. So Ali, if you can start.
Sorry, I don't have anything.
Okay. So Chris.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm going to meet Ali there and say, no, I don't have anything specific.
Okay. Gareth. Gareth, are you on? I can see you, but we can't hear you so far. Okay, I think maybe we'll skip Gareth until later. So Udom. I think you're on mute right now, Udom, so if you're talking, we can't hear you.
Oh, is that me? Okay, so this is Uttam. As I said, I set up my Mayor application, and then I wanted to run as a benchmark using JMeter, which I did. But I don't have a configuration, standard configuration, and I would like to have that. And so far, I've been able to run Acme Air, so that's what I've been doing.
Okay, sounds good. Long.
Yeah, it's you know, by the way. Is this specific for just benchmarking in general or benchmarking for Acme? I just wanted to sort of clarify. We've been doing some benchmarking for some of our libraries internally, and we could share that. But we haven't really had a chance to work with Acme Air.
No, but just in general, you know, related that would be requested.
I'll let Michael actually speak to this because he's been sort of taking.
Yeah, I guess primarily over the last 6-7 months, I've been focused on improving performance of a library called Falcor, which is just a data interchange library, and so still have a lot of room to do that. And right now, just using a few like flame graphs and benchmarking to give most of the performance improvements. But that's primarily been my focus, and both on V8 and other.
Right. So the one thing that for what was the module name again? I just want to add that to the notes.
Falcor, so it's Falcor. It's a, if you know, it is like a JSON-based data access library that we use quite a bit here.
Okay, Falcor, thanks. The interesting thing out of that might be, are there things that we can bring to this group in terms of, you know, tools or processes that you've used? You know, you've done the benchmarking, and then it's like, okay, You mentioned flame graphs. Is there anything that would make sense for this group to kind of provide context or guidance on in terms of people doing that so that they could gain from the experience you've built up?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a bad idea to. I mean, there's a lot of good blog posts already out there, so it's pretty easy to find all the information you need to do it, but it'd be probably good to have it in one place.
Yeah, like even if we had an issue, which is, where if you're aware of the key ones for people to read, maybe just put them all together in an issue where it's like a getting started with benchmarking
Okay.
blog post. Okay. Okay, Gareth, I think you're back on. So we're just doing the round
Yes,
table.
I've just joined from my phone. So can you people hear me now?
I can.
Excellent. So since the last meeting, I spent a bit of time working on the issue that I'd seen with Kraken. So I went to build V8 on its own, and as it stands, it doesn't seem that the regression can be seen in V8 when it's running on its own. So I just want to spend a little bit more time and make sure that it's not that perhaps my copy of V8's been compiled slightly differently to V8 that runs within Node. I know there's a few patches that get put on top of V8 in Node, so I'm going to look into that. But otherwise, it looks like it could be possibly a Node regression, but I want to spend a bit more time before I'm certain of that. And then also more recently, I've been running a few of the startup scenarios that we've discussed in the other thread. So hopefully I'll be in a position to contribute those back into the community very shortly.
I think that leaves me. So I've spent some time working on the sort of infrastructure pieces to capture the data once the benchmark runs, push it into a database, and then generate charts from those. Had a little bit of a discussion with the build team in terms of how we might set up the mechanics of automating that and pushing it out to a website so that they're visible. And I've captured a lot of that in the issue that I think we'll discuss specifically as one of our agenda items. So I won't go into the detail there. So that's our roundtable. Going into the agenda, so I think we might as well come back first to Udam's questions about Acme Air. Now, I think Surya and Gareth are probably the two best people to answer those questions. Now, Gareth, were you here when he was asking about like the standard JMeter?
Yeah, so pretty much the JMeter script can be run out of the box. Typically, when I run it, I use 25 client threads per instance of Node. So if I'm running Node and cluster with, say, 4 child threads, I then set the JMeter client threads to be 100. And I found that in our environment is enough to saturate the Node instance. So that's probably the most sort of tuning or configuration that I tend to do.
Okay. I tried one 60 clients, and then I noticed over time the throughput went down considerably from I think 2,000 requests per second to some 600 or so. Is that what you see?
In the space of one run or after multiple runs?
In space of one.
Okay, I've not seen that behavior before. I have noticed that if you do multiple runs after you've done 10 or 15, the throughput does start to go down, which I think is something to do with the database getting into a bad state. So for my performance runs, I tend to drop the database and then recreate it for each run to try and get the system in the same state each time to try and make the results a little bit more repeatable. But no, I've not seen the throughput drop during a run.
So I have a output. Maybe is there any way we can connect and kind of share the data, saying how does it look, and kind of verify the result?
Yeah, that should be fine. Oops, sorry.
It probably makes sense to open an issue and do it in that.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
That
I'll
way,
look out for that then.
Okay. So there is another follow-up question with that. In addition to that, was do we or have you considered a standard machine configuration while doing these runs? How do we compare one run versus another across machines, or how do we consider what is a baseline? Let's say, for
Right. So
example,
that is a key issue. So far, the work I've been doing it's been more about, can we set up a machine in the community so that we can spot regressions, but it doesn't solve that problem of how do you compare against each other. I don't know, Gareth, do you have any thoughts on that?
So, in our environment, we have a specific set of machines. So we, for example, when we're testing Linux on Intel, because in my team we're also looking at other platforms, for example, like Linux PowerPC and so on. But we have a specific machine that we do all of our Linux on Intel testing. So the idea is that we should be able to spot regressions because we're always using the same machine. However, other things can come into play that may make the results slightly less repeatable. So we may choose, for example, if we're testing Node version, the latest 4.2.4, we may use 4.2.3 as a baseline and be sort of alternating measurements. So do a measurement on 4.2.3 and then a measurement on 4.2.4, and that should also hopefully get around any differences in the machine state. But obviously that would assume that you're able to run multiple runs on the same machine.
I mean, so it looks like the machine. It looks like a machine configuration is hard to set. So can we set something about a processor can be at, let's say, 2 gigahertz processor speed, and it should have at least 8 gigabyte of memory, and things like that. Maybe we should have some other criteria to set up a standard machine, and then
Yeah. There.
Okay.
Okay. I don't know what was happening there.
Okay, sorry, Udom, can you say that again?
Yeah, so I was thinking, looks like the setting up a standard machine is hard because of the variants of vendors. But can we at least set up some kind of criteria about how much memory it should have? Let's say 8 gigabyte or 4 gigabyte of RAM, and maybe it should run at 2 gigahertz speed. Things like that, some other external criteria, and then whether you can use the Intel platform, AMD platform, PowerPC platform, or any platform, but at least this should be the minimum thing we should have, and then we can do some kind of comparison.
Who's going to pay for these machines? Is it the foundation? Do we have machines that are readily available?
But this I'm just suggesting, if I want to do a run, at least I have a base configuration set up by us or by this committee, saying, hey, if you are doing any kind of benchmarking run, your machine should at least have this much, and publish result based on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good start. That's a good start, but the thing is, like, even like DRAM itself is so variable depending on the type and speed and processors that I don't know. Would we be better served by picking like an EC2 instance type or something that people can use, because at least that's a little bit less variable.
But I guess that there's a couple of reasons why we're interested in Acme. The first and simplest one is the regression side. So for the community, we have a dedicated machine which won't change, and we can use it for those regression runs. The issue of comparing against different machines against different platforms, I think that's a much more complicated and contentious issue, right? So I guess maybe we should open an issue to start discussing the framework and purpose of that. Because yeah, I mean things like an Amazon instance, it's like that maybe be more consistent, but you can't compare against different platforms then, right?
Hey, even if you run it on the same machine with all the exact same environment stuff, you can still see something like a 10 to 15% difference run over run.
Right.
So you're not going to get I mean, if we're running just one test and then sometime later we make a change and run one test, it could look like you have a terrible performance issue.
But really, kernel or something.
Yeah, it's risky even saying that every time you run it on this one machine, you're going to get this result.
Right, and that's where, when building up the regression side, which is the simpler one, which I think is a good place for us to focus on initially, we can, I've started to capture some data for startup and footprint, which are probably the easier ones, so that we can at least look at how consistent the data is, and then, okay, once you see that, yeah, it varies within a certain range, then maybe we can move to the next level of saying, well, if it varies outside that range, let's now flag it up. So I think for Acme Air, I'd almost say, if once we get it running just in terms of the regression and have some data, that variance will help us decide whether, what we've got is good enough to actually help you spot regressions or not.
Yeah, long as part of when we're running that, we're running at least, I mean, I would recommend no less than 30 tests ran and running an actual proper t-test, because the data sets are going to be probably really close. And so, as long as we're making large enough sample sizes, then yeah, you can at least ignore some of those 10% differences run over run.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's where I think we'll work through for each one what we have to do to get a number that's reliable enough. The footprint ones actually seem to be, quite. They're in a pretty small range, depending on what you think a small range is, but they're surprisingly close, in my opinion, anyway.
Yeah, and certainly for our internal runs, and Gareth can give you some more accurate information on this, but we run our benchmarks in batches of like 10 runs, then run 5 times back to back, and we clear out the machines between each run. So we do tend to get pretty consistent numbers from day to day. Yeah, we don't get a situation where there's like a 5% difference between Monday and Tuesday with no code change. When we get a difference, it's because we've changed something.
So I guess the original question was about defining some config we could compare or something like that. But I think really we probably need more discussion in a GitHub item about what we'd be trying to achieve by defining that, how it would be used, and so forth before we start picking numbers. So I think it would. Sorry, go ahead. I guess I was just going to suggest, Udom, that you create an issue, providing the context and the discussion, and to kick off that discussion.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions, Udom, on the Acme Air front that we haven't discussed?
Not on Acme Air. So I will connect with Gareth about how I run the Acme Air, how I run JMeter, and kind of try to get sense of the correctness of the data I have generated.
Yeah.
The one additional question I had was, are there any other benchmarks I can use other than Acme Air to kind of do more of a benchmarking of Node.js itself? What are other benchmark people are using? Which can I find them online? Or how does that work?
That's what we're trying to capture in some of our issues. In that, if you look at the issues on this workgroup repo, there's a number of issues where we'd like to document what those are. We haven't closed on, other than Acme Air being one of the good system level ones, there's suggestions for others, but I don't think there's any others that we've actually, moved forward in terms of saying, yeah, that's going to be the next one we would put into the benchmarks. I'm still working on getting Acme Air in. I don't know if anybody else has other specific ones to add beyond the lists we've discussed.
And if there are no other benchmarks, I mean, I was thinking about it. So what should we at least think about the criteria like machine? Should we at least think about the criteria for a benchmark? What that benchmark should do, how should we measure, and things like that. Then we can maybe, even if we don't have, we can probably come up with a benchmark from other real applications.
Yeah, absolutely. There's 2 or 3 issues open to cover those kind of discussions. So I guess my first suggestion would be to take a look at those, see what's been discussed, and then start making additional suggestions or proposals in those would make sense.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so moving on to the next agenda item, I think I'd just like to go through the proposal that I put together, which is issue. Let me just find the issue number. It's issue number 23. So if people could open that up, I don't know if they've had a chance to. I guess my first question is, how many people have had a chance to read through that yet? It's just, I'm deciding, should I actually walk through people there, or does everybody already read it?
I think it might be helpful to walk through it. I mean, I briefly read through it, but it'd be helpful to get more context.
Okay. Okay, so basically, the first step is to actually run some of the benchmarks, define what they are and all that, but there are a couple which seem like they'd be fairly easy to run, and we could, provide the work us through the process of what all we're going to need to run them and capture them and stuff like that. So I did that with the footprint benchmark. It's an existing benchmark actually in the benchmark subdirectory in the node distribution, and it simply prints the residence set size, in JavaScript. So it runs a script that starts up, prints the residence set size, and then finishes. So you get the residence set size at startup. More recently, there was an issue where we discovered that startup was likely regressed because we hadn't properly turned on snapshots. So there was a request to also include startup as one of the things that we're covering in benchmarking. So I added a simple variant of that as well, and Gareth's been contributing some discussion on that front in terms of different ways we should potentially measure that. Working through the first case, there's a couple different pieces. There's a benchmark machine, which we have, it's a dedicated machine, nothing else runs there. I haven't spent a lot of time, stripping out processes and the various things we'll probably have to do in the fullness of time to make sure, we get as reliable as possible runs. But for the simple initial ones, it hasn't been an issue. So we have that physical machine that is the same run to run, and that's where I've set up now I've actually got 3 jobs, which are experimental benchmark jobs, which basically build a particular node version and then run the footprint and startup benchmarks. You then, having done that, so you've got a job in the output, you can see the result, but you don't want to have to go look at that. So the next step was it actually publishes that data to another machine, which is a virtual machine running the database and some scripts to use the data in the database. So at the end of the run, it then posts through a simple wget the data from the benchmark, and it uses, like I have a particular benchmark ID, this is the result for a particular stream, and then here's the value for the particular result along with the date. I think that's everything that's in the database is those 4 values. And so what I have there is some very simple scripts that just use wget to basically post to a server that's running on that other data machine, so that the data goes into a database and you can later generate charts and look at the data. On the benchmark machine side, I wrote a very simple node-based server, which basically just accepts the wget post and stores the data into the database. It uses MySQL, which was simple to install, very simple 4-table database. And again, I wrote that in Node. It's a very small number of lines of code, so there's not a lot for us to maintain. It's easily understandable. The one thing that still needs to be done on that front is to, basically control the communication with certificates. It is between two machines within the same data center, the same software data center, and it's controlled by using their local IP. So I don't think anything else could get at them anyway, but the next step is to add certificates. So that server basically takes the data, posts it into the database. Then the next thing I want to do is once a day generate cumulative graphs from the data that you have in the database. So for a particular benchmark ID, grab the data for the streams, which can be like 4.x, 0.12, master, and generate a graph that we can then post on the Node website to show, how we're doing on benchmarks, and people can look to say, hey, are there regressions or not? To generate the graphs, I again put together some, fairly small amount of Node code, which uses chart.js to generate a chart, and then phantom.js to, basically render that into a PNG, which we can publish. And so the plan is to have a cron job that basically says, okay, let's generate the graphs and publish them out. And I did just yesterday modify the code. If you looked at it before, I modified it yesterday so that it's actually more generic, and that adding new ones is much easier. I did that as I was doing the startup, adding the startup graph. It's at the point now where if you just create a new directory under the benchmark subdirectory in GitHub, and put a JSON configuration file along with a base page.html, you can have it generate new graphs for you. So that's kind of the high level. If you look in there, there's an example of the graphs that are generated. If you look in the issue, so it shows the footprint, which, if you look at it, actually there, it was up around 150 meg, dropped down for a few days, and then jumped up. And that gives you kind of the idea of the variation I'm seeing so far. They're not necessarily super pretty, but I think they communicate the data that we need to communicate there. And these ones I've done, that example I generated by hand, but we can set up cron jobs to, basically do it once a day and push them out. I think I've covered most of the main points. The details are in that item in terms of, in the benchmark, it's a stream ID, bench ID, time, and value that goes in so far. The next steps I've outlined, that if we think this is reasonable, and the simple scripts that I'm using to do this is a reasonable way to go forward. It's a little more cleanup on the scripts. I can coordinate with the build group to actually start publishing these to the Node.js website. The general approach, that the discussion with them so far is that what we'd likely do is build the website pages in the benchmarking repo, and then there would be a job that automatically mirrors them over to the website on a periodic basis. So we wouldn't need to actually access the website repos or environment, but by pushing stuff into the benchmarking work group under something like like benchmarking, Node.js benchmarking website, that would then be mirrored over. In terms of pushing stuff to the repo, this is one I would like to get some discussion in. I was asking them if there was anywhere to push the charts themselves. There doesn't really seem to be a natural place. So I think the current thinking was, I could push them directly to the Node.js benchmarking repo. I guess the only concern might be that, we're pushing, like, say, 40K, 50K charts every day to GitHub. So I don't know if people have any concerns over that. Anybody see that as an issue?
It doesn't sound like a big issue to me, but we could also generate the charts dynamically if I mean.
Yeah, I wanted to avoid the dynamic generation of the charts, because then you got to have your infrastructure running and available, and it's as opposed to just generate the PNG and then it's there for posterity, right? If I want to go see the data I had a week ago, it's a lot easier than if it's a dynamic generation. So that was my thinking on that front. The other issue will be to figure out that I haven't covered yet is like database backups and stuff like that. So that's another one to still haven't thought through. So, but I guess so. You guys don't see that there's an issue pushing. Probably we'd get up to like 10 or 20 charts once a day, kind of thing.
It's all GitHub space.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think it's probably fine. Like, I know I've had some people shown concerns if you check in large things into GitHub, because when you clone, you end up cloning them. But as long as nobody...
we have a separate repo? So if I wanted to make changes to the benchmark scripts, I wouldn't want to download all the PNGs because I don't care about those.
Yeah,
right, that would be... Sorry, go ahead.
Alternatively, we could just upload those to like S3 or something and link them, right? I think you can have like Markdown still render them, but not explicitly check into the repo.
Right, so that would be, yeah, I mean, is there a better place? But then you have to manage those S3 things, right?
I mean, they could just be like under certain, I don't know, like we could talk about having them under directories. So like every time a run occurs, you just, use the date timestamp or something initially super simple like that. I don't know. But yeah, I do share Lee's point of like, if I want to clone this repo now, I have to grab all of these assets, which as time goes on would be rather expensive.
Right. So I guess, like the GitHub repo is simple because it's you don't have to worry about backup or managing an instance or anything like that, right? So maybe we could ask, could we have like in addition to the benchmarking repo, a benchmarking data repo? Does that make sense? The alternative is something like you said, we'd have to find another machine, manage it somewhere, and probably think about backups as well.
I think just having a second repo for now would be easier, and we can figure out what we're running in the long term.
Does anybody know where Node.js.org stores its binary downloads? And we've got a file server that's being used for that, I would guess. Maybe there's some scope for reuse.
It's probably on the whatever the website uses, but the explanation of how the website was worked is that they check in the stuff for that into the repo that the website people have access for, and then they mirrored it over. Because I asked specifically the build workgroup, like, is there anywhere else where we can stick these things?
Yeah, but it's not like we're going to be putting the actual node builds, so the resultant binaries and the the MSI installer and so on in a repo. So there's going to be stored somewhere.
Yeah, I can ask that again. I'll ask again where the binaries are, that binary downloads are stored.
Yeah, it's just a thought.
Yeah, no, it's worth asking. I'll ask them again. Maybe they didn't quite think of that one when I was asking before. So I'll explore those two options: a second repo and where the binaries are stored, because those are two good things. Otherwise, I think that's the intro. I have the code is there in GitHub if people want to take a look at. Really, what I wanted to get out of this discussion is like, do we have general consensus that this all makes sense and I should, push ahead? I've put it into like an experimental subdirectory under the repo because it was something that we hadn't discussed or looked at. I think once I have general agreement, I'd want to move it out of there into just a more of a, say, a benchmarks directory where we then start building out the both the pieces to run them, but also the pieces to generate charts and all that kind of stuff. So I guess I can ask, does anybody disagree with the, moving this forward, making it more real in the repo?
Michael, I have one. This is Uttam. I have one suggestion. So for the testing purpose, can we use JMeter the way we are using with Acme Air? So it could be as a standard practice in case if we decide to use this one, we can at least have some standard tool to test it, which itself generates the graphs and charts and everything.
Yeah, JMeter, I mean, these are not, as I understand it, JMeter drives load against a website, right?
Yes,
So,
yeah, it is.
Yeah, so these particular benchmarks are not those kinds of benchmarks. They're basically, you run Node, it outputs something on the console, and we're taking the data from there.
Okay, I got it.
So I think when we get to Acme Air, that's a very good point. That if the tool that runs the load can already generate the graphs for us.
I mean, this is a silly, but can we not just use like the time command? Like time and then whatever else you're running, like time node, and then it'll tell you how much time it's going to view.
That's exactly what the startup one uses.
Right. So I feel like that's probably good enough for now. Gives you time.
Yeah. So the startup one basically runs time running an empty script, and then all the rest of 99% of my work was just saying, okay, I need something to get it over to the database, put it in there, and then pull that data out to display it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's good, right? That seems like it.
Yeah, and I think for things like once we run Acme Air, if the running framework already generates graphs, yeah, we could just reuse those. But I think we'll have a bunch of these where it's like we just want to very simply generate graphs. What I have now, basically, I did the startup. Once I did the refactoring to generalize it, the startup one, took me 5 minutes, and I had new graphs. So I think new ones will be easy to add as well.
Hey, I have a quick question about what are we attempting to measure here. It kind of, because if we're measuring the startup of Node, it seems like we're measuring more like Node and V8 and the underlying engine, as opposed to JavaScript itself. Which one are we attempting to measure for this project?
My opinion is we're more interested in Node as opposed to V8 and specifically JavaScript. Obviously, that forms, JavaScript affects performance, but what we'd like, in my mind, is a set of here are the key use cases for Node, and then benchmarks which validate that we're not regressing against those particular use cases.
Okay.
And so startup and footprint are a classic one for a runtime. Node starts up fast and doesn't use a lot of memory, so that's one of the those are two key things we want to make sure we don't change, right? So that they're easy starting points. Acme Air provides kind of like a system level test, so that's one of the use case type things. So but there'll be other ones.
I have a quick question because Acme Air does create a lot of noise in the sense that there's just a lot of stuff involved with it.
Yeah.
We know what they're using. We know what actual node-specific things they're going to be accessing. Can't we create a set of tests that are more designed as opposed to introducing any sort of noise from a library? Because, Express also does things in JavaScript that are for Express and keeping track of whatever they're keeping track of. Whereas if we know what they're keeping or what node-specific items they're using to, say, get the request and route them, then shouldn't we just test those as opposed to Express itself or the entire Acme Air?
I think you want to do both, to be honest. Like what you're mentioning, I think, are more micro tests, right? There's sort of like system tests, and then there's the unit. I don't know what the right word unit.
Yeah, there's like micro benchmarks which you can take, but these are like benchmarking a specific feature. But then putting it all together, you're also including the noise of this. So you could potentially just come up with what are the set of commands that someone's going to, or the set of items that people are going to access, put them all together, and I'm just a little weary of introducing libraries that we have an unknown performance impact. So that's always, if you're measuring Node, it's hard to measure Node if you're also measuring someone else's running library.
I would echo what Michael said. I think it's important to measure both, and as far as the end user experience is concerned, they are going to be using Express and they are going to be building an application on top of Express. So I think there's definitely, and there's a lot of noise. I think it's important that we surface that noise in the benchmark data that we gather and look at. So I think something like Acme Air is definitely useful.
So we have talked to Brennan Gregg a lot about this stuff, and one of his big recommendations is make sure you do have a pretty comprehensive suite of those quote-unquote micro benchmarks. So that way we know what's happening in Node, and kind of you can start to minus out that noise of other libraries. And so since there's a lot to test coming up, considering what has currently been done, so we pretty much have a pure green field at this point.
Yep.
It just seems like maybe starting from the node end as opposed to the application end might be easier to kind of start biting off chunks and making good progress.
Yeah, I think Node Acme we started with because it's an existing one. We just want to get, we have teams. So Surya and Gareth both have scripts and stuff running it. So they're working to contribute something that I can easily enable to capture that. So I don't know that Acme as a regression should divert us from anything else, because it should be a relatively low-hanging fruit. And then the other ones, it's just a matter of, if we have people who want to start working on those I think make sense as the two part where we want to have some system and some more specific feature type based ones.
Yeah, I think we probably all agree that there's a need for additional micro benchmarks. In terms of startup, in one of the keynote presentations at Node Interactive, the NPM team talked about how the average number of packages installed with an NPM install is 72 now. So that means that the application is going to require 72 modules. So the speed of doing require and actually loading those modules in, I think, is something we're very much going to care about for startup. So I guess doing a micro bench around the performance of require is actually quite a good one.
Yep.
I have some time dedicated to kind of work on some of this item, so I can definitely start taking an attempt of building out some sort of micro bench. I don't really like to use the term micro bench; it tends to have a negative connotation, but using out these small parts of the node core benchmarking.
Yeah, no, that would be great. And I think the other thing we need to figure out is how that fits in with what's already there, because there is that benchmarks subdirectory in the node distribution. So I think it would be, I haven't had enough time to go through that in detail to see, does it cover some of these key areas that, say, you'd have in mind, or is it that, the stuff you have is completely new? But I think if you could consider what's there already as part of what you do, that would be a good thing.
Okay.
Just because it's like it is already there, right? So it's like we should either supplement or if things that are there don't make sense, we should replace them with something that does. I think we could probably take some ownership guidance of that, that set of benchmarks that's shipped with Node itself.
Yeah. That's
okay.
Thanks.
Okay. So any other discussion on that? Like I don't hear any objections, so I'm taking that as the okay to move forward. I'm gonna, based on that, I'll move things out of the experimental subdirectory. I'll work with the build group to they use Ansible to deploy machines. So what we'll need to do is actually, set up some Ansible scripts which would deploy the two benchmark machines properly to support these different benchmarks. And then I think we can use it to add it. If we had another micro benchmark, it would be very easy to generate another, to run it and generate the chart based on the jobs and stuff that I have here so far. So I guess I was just going to say I haven't heard any objections, so I guess I'll move forward with that. The last thing on the agenda then was to look at issues. So let's just do a quick walkthrough of there. I don't think there's been a lot of activity on that, but we can just do a quick sniff sanity check of that. So I'm opening up the issues. I'm going to go in reverse order. So benchmarking use cases. I'll just open that to see if there's been any more discussions. So the last comment was from August, so I don't think anything on there. But I think, I think it was Udom. You mentioned that we should be trying to define some of the different things we should be benchmarking. So I think that was intended to try and capture those use cases. We'd like to come out with here are the key things that are important that Node performs well on, and then from that you can build benchmarks or find existing benchmarks or whatever. But that's the issue. We hope to track that in. Related is the next one, which is candidate benchmarks, where there's been some suggestions. I'm just looking to see if there's anything new there. So not since September. So we do have some ideas there. Once we get past the initial ones in the framework, we can look at some of the other ones that were already suggested. And again, if you have any other suggestions, add them there. The next one is actually, again, more specific to micro benchmarks, but along the same thing of, what micro benchmarks should we have. So I think, Michael, probably it sounds like you're going to be pushing that forward a little bit. So if you want to, use that item to spur some discussion or outline what you're doing, that would be great.
Okay. Yeah, I have a good idea of where to start.
Okay. The next one is the benchmarking dependencies. I don't think there's anything there. That was just some discussion about, the benchmarks will depend on things like the versions of modules you use and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's still a valid discussion. Benchmarks for V8. This was actually, there's a suggestion that they may actually take some of our benchmarks to run them. I don't think we're at the point where we have, a concrete set that we would suggest, but I think it's worth leaving open so that we don't forget that idea. The next one, JSPerf-like tool for benchmarking Node.js. Okay, last comment was on the 12th. Okay, so this is, somebody was going to work on some tools to help for benchmarking different things, but they haven't had time to push it forward, so there's nothing new to talk about there. The next one is events benchmark test. This is actually was open August 15th, so there's just a comment that in one of the archive repos for Node, which is now not being used, there was some proposed new benchmarks for events that didn't get landed. So again, in sort of the overall effort of looking at smaller benchmarks or micro benchmarks, that's something we should probably get to in terms of if we want a benchmark for events, that's something that was proposed but didn't actually get in. The next one is the issue that Gareth had opened, the regression on Kraken JS Bench, which I think he's already given us an update on, so I don't think we need to talk about that one. Let's see, there was a comment. I guess, Chris, you commented on that, asking if it was on the agenda for a previous meeting. Is there any other discussion you think we should have on that front?
No, that was just to get the issue from Gareth on our last agenda, so we're discussing it, so that's all good.
Okay, good. Otherwise, next one's benchmark meeting, which is fine. Then there's one which is track startup speed. So this is relatively new. We've talked a little bit about that in the discussion in that there was a request to track startup speed. I'm just looking at some of the, I know, Ali, you mentioned maybe running Node-PE, so something which is lighter weight than running an empty script. I don't know why, but the first one actually was slower, but yeah, I can try the other one that you've got there to see if there's something lighter weight. I agree, kind of we probably want a couple of different startups. The lightest weight one, and then there'll be some more where we should probably test a little bit more than just the startup and shutdown. And I guess there's even the variance of, what I'm testing with time is startup and shutdown versus just startup. Right, and I guess the last comment, which was like 2 hours ago, is I think maybe an echoing that require is interesting one to look at. It's by Sam, I think from Strongloop, commenting on that he has been affected by how slow require is. So maybe that's another bit of data saying that's definitely an interesting one to look at.
Yeah, that should be a part of the micro. benchmark suite, and so hopefully that will be taken care of.
Okay. I mean, when you say a suite, are you going to try and work on a whole suite and then contribute it, or like incrementally build it up?
One at a time, of course, because
Yeah.
I mean, I would never get anything done if I tried to do too much.
Sure.
I mean, ideally, what I would like to do is require and event propagation. Like those are my two first ones, I think.
Okay, great. Because I think it's once we have a couple, if it's like this one that people think are important, we should start tracking the data, because that's the first step to see how consistent, and can we get to the point where we alert people when things look like they're going wrong, is kind of what I have in mind. Okay. So Garris had a few comments in there in terms of putting together one for, like, say, Express startup versus just Node startup. So I think we'll work through a bunch of variants in there. So if you're interested, that's a good one to look at. But I think it's got some reasonably active discussion already. Then capturing benchmark data was the one that I mentioned we went through today. And then finally I see, okay, Michael, you opened the one to join the working group, which I'll take care of. So I see we're just out of time, and I think we've covered the list there. So is there anything else people think we should talk about before we close for today? Okay, it sounds like not. Otherwise, I will, I'll schedule another meeting for, I think 3 to 4 weeks has seemed to be a reasonable interval. And, we'll carry on the discussions and the issues between now and then. Thanks, everybody, for showing up.
Thank you.
Okay. Talk to you guys later. Bye.